Hi, I'm Adam Porter, and this is my top 100 board game mechanisms of all time. In 2021, around this time of year, I made my top 100 board games of all time. But of course, this year, that's not going to have changed all that much, so I thought it was more interesting to take a slightly different slant on it and try something else. I'm a board game designer from Wales in the UK. I've got a number of published games under my belt, and I'm sure I'll be touching on those as we go along, as we hit the mechanisms employed in those games. But really, I do like making videos about mechanisms. I like delving into board games, working out how they work, and building up a vocabulary of different game design mechanisms that I can pick from when I want to solve a certain problem in one of my designs, or create a certain emotion in the players, or represent something from the world that I'm trying to create. And so that's what this list is all about. Now, there aren't hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of mechanisms out there. I'm sure there could be if you really hone in on fine detail, but it was quite a challenge to come up with 100. What I've tried to do, and particularly as we get to the later videos, you know, the higher end of this list, is come up with things where, yeah, I'd be sort of excited about playing a game like that, or certainly not turned off by it. So if somebody said, I would like to play this game, it's got these mechanisms in it, I might go, yeah, do you know what, that sounds like it might be up my street. So that's the idea of the list. So let's start with number 100, which is grid-based movement. So grid-based movement is not something that's going to necessarily draw me to a game. It's not going to be a major selling point for me, but I do like it. I like that we're honing in on an individual sort of character, an individual figure, and we're using, the lens we're looking through is really, you know, quite tight, quite drawn in, quite focused. And we're watching that individual moving around a real space, whether that's a dungeon or a football pitch or a house, whatever it is. And the specificity of grid-based movement, the accuracy of it, as opposed to, for example, if we were playing Warhammer and measuring out long distances with tape measures. And very closely related to number 100 is number 99, which is using miniatures and stats. So what I'm talking about here is little plastic miniatures, usually plastic, sometimes metal or resin, but little miniatures that represent the player, the playing piece, or represent me on the board. And I like that these can be separated out from each other by having a series of different statistics for how far they can move, how well they can fight, how well they can defend, and so on. And this might dictate how we roll dice and so on to resolve various different situations. But I specifically like that the figure looks very different to anybody else, it represents me on the table, and it's got its own set of characteristics that make it distinct from anybody else's figure. I also quite like painting these figures. Now, it's not a major draw. I don't get particularly drawn into these massive Kickstarters full of plastic, but now and then I do get excited about a miniatures game. Number 98 on the list is a genre that I'm calling dice building. I don't really know whether there is a formalized term for this or an accepted term among game designers, but what I'm talking about here is where we start out with the same set of dice for each player, and then throughout the game we adapt our dice. So the different dice results mean different things for me than they mean from somebody else. So for example, in a game like My Farm Shop, I roll my dice and then they're going to relate to the cards that I have laid out on my board, and they might give me different resources compared to, so if I roll a 7, it's going to give me something different to if somebody else rolls a 7. And I can then adapt that throughout the game, put new cards down that make my dice more and more valuable to me. Okay, this is something that's used in Catan, it's something that's used in Machikoro, and actually it's used extremely literally in the game Dice Forge, where we literally clip on new sides onto the dice, so they're physically becoming something different and giving us different resources every time we roll them. Number 97 is solitaire gaming. Now, I'm not a big solo player. I haven't done it an awful lot, but when I do play it, I can get into it, and I'm really interested in the mechanisms, partly as a design challenge for myself, because if I want to design something quite, you know, substantial now, I haven't had anything released actually that's hugely substantial, but I do work on these games and I do plan, I hope that one day I'll have a Euro game out there or something like that, something with a bit more weight to it than the sort of games that I've produced previously. And it's becoming more and more important that there's a solo mode available. So I'm trying to get my head around these things. What do people enjoy about them? What do people want from a solo mode? I made a whole video about different types of solo modes and artificial intelligence systems and things like that. Last year I had a lot of fun messing about with Zombie Teens Evolution, which is actually a multiplayer cooperative legacy game, but I played it solo and I really enjoyed it. I also play a lot of puzzles solo, and for me the puzzle board game thing, it's a very grey area. What's a board game, what's a puzzle? So I tend to include these as part of the board game family. Number 96 is memory games. Now this is something which has pretty much been relegated to children's games. And I think that's kind of a shame, because I think it's actually a really fun mechanism. A lot of people don't like it, and I think it's true of a lot of the sort of fringe mechanisms that we'll come across throughout this list. Strategy gamers, they really enjoy strategic thinking, meaningful decisions and this sort of thing, and then they get frustrated if actually they've got a bad memory. And they say, well, you know, if you've got a better memory, you're going to win than somebody else, and so that's not fair. We're not on a level playing field. But of course that's true of all games. If I've got a better strategic mind than you, I'm going to beat you at a heavy strategy game. And so with memory games, I think I wouldn't want to play something hugely long that had a massive degree of memory in it. But games like Stratego, and that has a high memory element to it. Trick-taking games have a big memory element to them. And as well as your pure memory games like Deja Vu or Pika Mouse, where it's literally just, can you remember what you've seen? Number 95 on the list is area majority. So I better define this one, I guess, for people who may not know what area majority means. What we're talking about is, if I've got more of my playing pieces in one section of the board than anybody else, then I'm going to get some sort of benefit from it, okay? Because I've got the majority in that particular area. And usually it means I'm going to get points as opposed to somebody else. And so this includes games like Las Vegas, where if I've got more dice in a particular area than anybody else, then I'm going to get some sort of reward. It might include games like Dominant Species, which has a whole range of different clever mechanisms around dominating certain spaces or having the majority on certain spaces, becoming extinct in certain spaces if you don't have the right resources available to you that you need in order to survive. So quite a complex system of controlling areas and holding majorities in order to score points. And then also games like Brew this year, which was a really cutthroat area majority game where you place dice onto different areas in the forest to try and claim the points from those cards, but other people can use special powers to put dice on top of your dice and claim it and take that victory away from you. And this is one of the things that means that area majority is quite low down my list. Although I enjoy it, it can be a bit cutthroat, can be a bit nasty, can be quite a lot of confrontation, a bit mean-spirited, and that sometimes turns me off some games, particularly if we were playing something extremely long and I felt like I was wiped out in the early stages and then had to sit through the rest of that game. 94 is simultaneous selection. So this is where we each select a card from our hand, usually a card anyway, and we play them at the same time. We all reveal together and then we see what we get. And we may have been aiming for the same thing, or we may not. Sometimes these games say that if we've both selected the same thing, we split the pot, whereas the person who selected it on their own, they get everything. Sometimes if you've selected the same spot as somebody else, neither of you gets anything. It can be quite a frustrating experience because sometimes through no fault of your own, you've just chosen the wrong thing, and you might find time and time again you're clashing with the other players while somebody else is running away with the game through no real skill, just through luck or judgment, I suppose, maybe, in terms of reading what the other players might want. But when it works, it's really satisfying, particularly in a short game, something where it doesn't matter too much if you get a little bit behind or have a bad round of it. Well, we can play again and maybe I'll do better next time. So I really enjoyed Heuschrecken Poker, or Grasshopper Poker, that came out this year, that has that mechanism as its core. Number 93 is the bingo mechanism, or at least that's what I'm calling it. It's where we call out something or we reveal a card and then everybody has to work with that same thing. So in Karuba, for example, I draw a tile, everybody has to work with that tile, put that tile onto their board. Or in Avenue, we reveal a card, everyone has to draw that shape on their sheet of paper. And people can draw it in different places, but we're all working with the same basic thing, the same basic resource to start with. Tiny Towns allows the players a little bit more agency in that the player can define what the piece is that everyone has to work with. So I call out a colour. Everybody has to work with that colour. Okay, so one player chooses, but everybody else has to work with what they've been given. Number 92 is action points. So action points were really popularised by Wolfgang Kramer and Michael Kiesling in their Mask trilogy of games, which I really love. Cusco, which used to be Java, Mexica, and Tikal. And in these games, you've got a whole load of, I can't remember how many action points it is, maybe 8 action points that you can spend in various different ways. They might allow you to move, or to dig, or to cross different areas of terrain, or to set up a camp, or, you know, all sorts of things, to add another level to a temple, to bring new people onto the board. So you've got a menu of different options to pick from. And this is really, really freeing. It feels quite sandboxy. I can do all this different stuff. The downside of action points is that it can lead to a little bit of analysis paralysis as players sit and think about what they want to do. They've got so many options available to them, so many different possible combinations of those different types of action points. Which ones are they going to use? And that can lead to the game running slow, the other players sitting around with nothing much to do, so it can be a little bit frustrating, which is why it's down the bottom end of my list. It's starting to feel like action points are becoming a little bit outdated, like maybe they can be, certainly modern games can use them, but they have to be used with a bit of caution, perhaps a little bit of finesse, you know, just to make sure that these action points really work without bogging the game down. And the final one on this first list of 10 games, number 91, is cooperative gaming. So cooperative gaming, I don't know, I have a love-hate thing with cooperative gaming. I do enjoy it. Obviously, I enjoy sitting around with other players and having a nice time. I don't enjoy those games where there's somebody who's obviously better than everybody else at solving the puzzle. And so, I mean, the logical thing is to just let them do it, so you're along for the ride. I find that a bit frustrating. It's not their fault, you know, and I've played with people who really try and sit back and let you get on with it, but ultimately you know that they know what the best thing to do is. Maybe they've played the game more than you, or maybe they've just got a great mind for it. So I really like cooperative games that are a little bit more off the beaten path, you know, not so much the pandemic style games, which can lend themselves to that alpha player syndrome that we've just talked about, but maybe things like Mysterium and Magic Maze, where you know, we have some sort of limitations that make that alpha player thing impossible. Maybe real-time cooperative games that just make it hard for anybody really to bully their way through and dominate. So those are my first 10 in my top 100 board game mechanisms. And as we go through the list, I'll probably get more and more excited about these things and be saying less of the sort of, oh, I love it, hate it, you know, less of the lukewarm sort of praise as we get higher up the top 100. So I thought I'd finish each of these videos from this top 100 by coming up with one mechanism that I don't enjoy. So as we go through the 10 different videos, there'll be 10 mechanisms that I don't enjoy in games. And I'm going to try and go in order. So number 10 is something which I find a little frustrating. I can't say I wholly hate it. And in fact, it's something that I employed in my own game, Pikoko. But this is where a game asks you to play multiple rounds that are ultimately pretty much exactly the same. Yeah, so you just play multiple rounds, add up your score, there we go, you've finished the game, with no real progression from one round to the next. I always feel like I'm playing multiple games, and so why am I limited to the number of games that I'm told to play by the rulebook? Why can't I play just one game? Yeah, okay, it might be 5 minutes or 10 minutes long, that's fine, I'm happy to play a 5-minute or a 10-minute game. Why do I have to be artificially told to play 3 games of it and then add up the scores? Now, don't get me wrong, I understand the thinking there. It's usually to mitigate the randomness of the card draw, so you know it reduces the luck element of a game, or it might be to mitigate the advantage of being start player if in each round of the game we change who the start player is. But I always feel like more is lost than is gained in these games by having multiple rounds. Actually, it's a mechanism that is employed in a lot of games that I love, I tend to ignore that rule and just play it as many times as I want. It might be once, it might be 5 times, but I'm not going to stick to that rigid 3 games or 3 rounds rule that it says in the rule book. Maybe I'm a rebel. Anyway, I'll see you. I think I'm probably going to do these every 2 days, so I'll see you in a couple of days. In the meantime, let me know what you think about the mechanisms that I've talked about. Do you enjoy those? Do you hate them? What games feature those and really sort of highlight those different mechanisms?